Two young Dutch women go missing in the jungles of Panama. This is all things creepy. Let's begin. Kremers and Froon were two Dutch students in their early 20s. They went missing on the 1st of April 2014 whilst hiking in the El Pianista Trail in Panama. The two girls were students from Netherlands. They were roommates living in the same dorm, and they had saved up for this 6-week trip to Panama in the hopes of gaining some life experience and learning Spanish. They had initially arrived on the 15th of March 2014, and they toured the country for 2 weeks before eventually arriving at Boquete in Chiriquí. Here they had planned to volunteer with the children, give back to the community, continue to learn Spanish and get to know the locals. At around 11 AM on the 1st of April, after arriving in Boquete on the 29th of March, they went hiking near the clouded forest that surrounded the Baru volcano on the El Pianista Trail. As you can imagine, this is a scenic location, and it's not too out of the ordinary that they would want to hike and explore this location. It's not known exactly when the girls went officially missing. However, mixed sources suggest that a local restaurant owner lent the girls their dog to go on the hike with and became alarmed when the dog didn't return home. The girls missed an appointment with a tour guide on the 2nd of April, and they had also been suspiciously not sending the previously daily text messages they'd been sending to their parents, which raised alarms as well. Shortly after, the local authorities started to search the area, and on the 6th of April, the girls' parents arrived in Panama along with police, dog units and detectives from the Netherlands to conduct a full-scale search of the forest for 10 days, even offering a $30,000 reward for any information. Sadly, nothing was found, and the search was eventually called off. However, 10 weeks later, on the 14th of June, a local woman turned in Froon's blue backpack. She reportedly found it by a riverbank near her village of Alto Romero. This was in the Bocas del Toro province. The backpack contained 2 pairs of sunglasses, $83 in cash, Froon's passport, a water bottle, Froon's camera, 2 bras, and the women's phones in good condition. Both of the phones were then forensically analysed, revealing the following information. For Froon's phone, which was a Samsung Galaxy S3, there was an attempted call made at 16:51 on the 1st of April. This was to the European Emergency Services, 112. There was a second call attempt made on the 2nd of April, and that was early in the morning. And then another call attempt made. This was approximately 4 hours after the first, and as well as calling the 112 number, they also attempted to call the 911 phone number as well, which would be to the Panama local authorities. Then, approximately 3 hours later, at 13:50 hours, there was an attempt to check the signal. Then at 16:19 hours, there was another attempt to check the signal, and after this, the phone was left on for the rest of the night. Then in the following morning, on the 3rd of April, at 7:36 hours, the phone was turned off. The following day, on the 4th of April, at 4:50 hours, there was another attempt to check the signal, and then again at 0500 hours. And after this, the battery was empty, and there was no further activity, as presumably the phone had died. So now we move on to Kramer's phone, which was an iPhone 4. So the first call attempt was on the 1st of April 2014, the day that they went missing, and this was at 16:39 hours, and that was to 112, that emergency number. Then there was another call attempt at 0814, and this was on the 2nd of April, so a day, a night if you will, had passed, and this was to 112 as well. And then on the 3rd of April, once again early in the morning, so 0932 hours, there was a call attempt, this time to 911. And then there was a signal check at 11:47, and at 15:59 there was another signal check. Then on the following day, on the 4th of April, at 10:16 hours, another signal check, and then another signal check again, 13:42. So at 10:50 On the 5th of April, there's another signal check, and bear in mind at this point the other phone is dead. There's no further activity. And then, interestingly, at 13:37 hours, there was another signal check. However, this time the PIN was entered incorrectly, so they checked it without actually entering the PIN. Then on the 6th of April, 10:26 hours, there was another attempt to check the PIN, and at 13:37, there was another attempt to check the PIN, and neither of those, the PIN was entered correctly. So bear in mind, this is just data on how the phone was accessed. We don't actually know who was accessing the phone. So someone has attempted to access the phone and they've entered the PIN incorrectly, which naturally is quite unsettling. However, we'll get into that further a bit later. So then from the 6th of April, there's no further activity all the way until the 11th of April. And this was at 10:51. And once again, a signal check with no PIN entered, the PIN entered incorrectly. And then at 11:56, the phone was switched off after being on for 1 hour and 5 minutes, and there was no further activity, even though there was 22% battery left. Froon's camera was then analysed, and it showed photographs taken from the 1st of April, and initially they were quite innocent. It showed the girls taking selfies, taking pictures of the scenery, and you could see by their expression they appeared to be having a good time, and there didn't seem to be anything sinister initially. The photographs in terms of location did suggest that the girls had been travelling along the Continental Divide. The photographs suggested they were wandering into wilderness, and this was hours before any attempt was made at emergency contact. Between 0100 and 0400 on the 8th of April, 90 flash photos were taken. And this was seemingly deep in the jungle, and due to the time, it was in near darkness. Due to how dark it is, it's almost impossible to make out much from the photos. Most of them show dense foliage, something that could suggest they're near to a river or ravine. And then there's several stranger photos. One is of a twig with a plastic bag wrapped around it on top of a rock. And there's another that appears to show a backpack strap with a mirror on another rock. And then there are several photographs that show the back of Kremers' head. We'll go into a bit more detail on those photos later. Naturally, the discovery of this backpack led to increased and intensified searches, and these were along the Culebra River. Kremers' denim shorts were eventually found, and this was on top of a rock opposite the bank of the tributary. And this was several kilometers away from where Froon's backpack had been discovered. There were rumours that the shorts were neatly folded up and zipped up, implying something sinister naturally. However, these rumours were disproved by photographs. 2 months into the new search, remains were finally recovered. A pelvis and a boot with a foot still inside were found. Soon at least 33 bones that were scattered throughout the area were discovered, and this was along that same riverbank where the backpack was found. And DNA testing later confirmed that these bones did belong to Kremers and Froon. They were distinguishable, however, as Froon's bones still had some skin attached. Kremers' bones had no skin and were bleached. Interestingly, a Panamanian forensic anthropologist who studied the bones found that there was no discernible markings. That means man-made or even animal, which is quite interesting. So that means the bones had not been scraped or scratched. So now that we've gone through the evidence, let's try and see which theories are the most compelling. So the first and most widely accepted theory is that there was simply an accident whilst the girls were hiking, and things escalated from there, and ultimately they both met an unfortunate demise as a result. So obviously these girls were not locals, they hadn't been on this hike before, it was unfamiliar territory, and this is an extremely remote part of the world. All it takes is a few wrong turns and you could find yourself extremely lost. Then of course, if you take into consideration that this was quite a rocky and hilly area, there were a lot of drops in the landscape, and all it would take is someone to fall down a ravine that you couldn't climb back up, and now you're even more lost because you're going to have to navigate your way back onto the trail. So of course the girls started to try to call emergency services 6 hours into their hike. So this suggests that they were either lost and trying to get help, or the accident had happened at this point and one or both of them were simply injured to the point where they were compromised or needed immediate medical attention. And of course, in an area this remote, there was simply no signal, so they had next to no chance of reaching emergency services, but they did keep trying, and it's for that reason that I believe they almost certainly got lost. Because of course, even if one of them was severely injured, of course there's the risk of predators and things like that, but if things are starting to look quite dire and you're not able to get any reception, I'm sure one of them, if they weren't lost, would have gone and got help and then came back. So naturally they're probably lost. One of them is potentially injured as well. So they're not getting any phone reception, so that's not going to help them out of this situation. So what do they have to do? They have to keep walking through the jungle. Naturally, it starts to get dark at night, so that adds a further layer to which they most likely got even more lost and struggled to travel. And maybe it's even at this point that one of them did get injured at night when they couldn't see. It's unclear. Perhaps one of them got injured earlier, or perhaps an injury happened when they were trying to escape, basically, and get back on course late at night. Naturally, at night, they might have been better off finding shelter, trying to sleep, but as you can probably imagine, in a situation like that, it's very unlikely that they slept the first night or maybe even the next few nights. They were probably quite dead set on getting out of there. And this might explain why the battery died relatively quickly on Froon's phone, because obviously they might have been using the flashlight to try and navigate their way through. If there are any experts in forensics out there, comment below if you can actually forensically see if a flashlight's been turned on or off on a Samsung Galaxy. So then on the 8th of April, this is several days after, they start trying to use the camera. They start taking numerous pictures, and most of these pictures are taken at night. So in my opinion, this is probably because they were trying to light up the area so they could see where they were going and save battery on their phone at the same time. Or alternatively, it was to give out signals in the night, so flashing lights in the night so any search parties could maybe detect them and come and save them. And then of course you have the photograph of Kramer's head. So obviously this is quite alarming, but if it aligns with this theory that one of them got injured or they got lost, it was probably Froon trying to take a picture of the back of Kramer's head. Maybe Kramer had complained that she had pain in the back of her head, or maybe she just sustained a new injury from falling whilst trying to track their way through the dense jungle at night, and she simply needed to take a flash photo to try and see if there was any injuries or blood or anything like that. And then of course this heavily implies that Kremers is the one that is injured. She sustained an injury, and for a while it seems like Froon and Kremers are both trying to trek through the jungle at the same time, but obviously if one of the party is more injured, eventually, sadly, they're going to have to be left behind. And perhaps Froon nobly thought that she would be able to go and get help and bring help back to Kramer, or maybe at this point, unfortunately, Kramer had already succumbed to her injuries and passed away. And this part of the theory actually would explain the very odd detail that there were multiple attempts to unlock Kramer's phone without the pin being put in properly. Because obviously if Froon has had to go on ahead without Kramer, she might simply not know the pin. She would obviously take this phone with her as it did have battery, and she might as well hold on to it because she could make an emergency call with it. Now the odd part that I've seen a lot of people point out is that you can make emergency calls on an iPhone without unlocking it. So even if you don't know the pin, you can make an emergency call. But Froon did have a Samsung Galaxy, so maybe she literally didn't know that. Or perhaps she was simply so delirious and probably at this point starving and thirsty that that idea didn't dawn on her, or she didn't try to figure that out if she didn't know. This theory also supports that strange photo of a mirror. Perhaps they were trying to create a mirror signal by flashing the light of the camera off of the mirror into the sky, and then also that strange stick with a plastic bag attached to it. Obviously, if someone's searching for them and they find that, it could very much help them track down the two girls. And then of course we have the remains, which of course do support this theory. Froon's remains were found much further away, implying she continued to travel on much further than Kramer. And then her remains actually show that they hadn't been decaying for very long, possibly 3 weeks, something like that, based on the forensics, which means she had lived a lot longer than Kramer. Now, if this was because Kramer had been injured and then passed away due to the injuries, this would make sense. And of course, Froon had kept walking until, unfortunately, she too passed away from a combination of dehydration, lack of food, and maybe she was partially injured as well. This would also explain the bleached bones of Kramer. Obviously, if she's been deceased a lot longer, that means the sun would have more time to bleach the bones, and there's much more time for any flesh to have eroded away or been picked at by scavengers. However, the strange part that is almost impossible to explain is the forensic analysis that showed a lack of any scratching on these bones. Obviously, in the jungle, it's wild out there, to say the least. If there's a deceased person, that is food. The wild animals are going to come in as soon as they know that that person's not moving anymore, and they're going to take what they can. That's just how nature works. So in theory, in this area, we have a lot of predatory animals. We have a lot of birds that would be able to scavenge something like this. They would be very good at picking up on the scent. Presumably, you would see scratch marks of these animals taking the flesh off the bone. So potentially, the Panamanian forensic analyst, maybe he got something wrong, maybe he misread something, or perhaps something happened to this body. And of course, we also have the dispersal of the remains. These were not simply laid out skeletons, they'd been widely dispersed, implying scavengers or someone had moved them around. There's also some interesting aspects and elements about the backpack which don't really add up. The woman that found it claims that she was at that same location the day before and didn't see it there. So this was 10 weeks after the disappearance. So it's not as though the girls had just been going past and only just left the backpack. It does imply that the backpack had turned up there long after both of the girls had passed away. Now maybe it had washed up on the river. That's not true either. The backpack was found completely dry, and naturally all the devices inside were intact. This had not been in the water at all. I think it would be interesting to look into the weather reports of that time. I couldn't quite find the information myself. Naturally, this is a subtropical area, and it probably doesn't rain quite as much as it does here in the UK, obviously. But in some of the photographs that they took, there does appear to be an overcast sky, which would imply, there's potentially some rain taking place here at some point. To me, it's not unusual that all of the belongings, the 2 phones, were all in one backpack, because obviously if one of the girls has continued on, she would have put all these items into a bag and taken them with her, and her remains were indeed found nearby to the backpack. That was Froon. It's also interesting that no cause of death could officially be confirmed. It was believed to be exposure for both of them, but obviously this was not clear. This was just a loose theory by the forensics team. So a lot of these discrepancies and unusual pieces of evidence lead on nicely to some of the alternative theories. The main one, of course, being that foul play was involved. So that would, of course, imply that for whatever reason, another person has decided to cause harm to these girls, and presumably directly or indirectly ending their lives. So let's go over some of the main motives of foul play. Of course, initially there's the financial motive. This is a poorer area of the world. This is 2 European women. 2 locals, they would be presumed to be quite wealthy. So maybe they were followed by someone, maybe they were discovered by someone out in the jungle, and that individual decided to rob them, or had planned to rob them, or maybe even something worse, decided to kidnap them, use them to make some sort of money. Thankfully, there isn't much evidence to support this. Presumably, if someone had attempted to rob the girls spontaneously, or maybe if they'd premeditated it to an extent, they would have taken the iPhones, the camera, all of these valuable items that they could have quickly sold on. Or if they were fearing repercussions, someone tracking the iPhone back to them, they would have at the very least have taken the cash money that was in the backpack. So then we move on to even more sinister motives. Kidnapping. Perhaps these two girls were kidnapped, held at gunpoint, at knife point. Maybe they were just physically too weak to resist, and they were kidnapped, taken out into the woods, or maybe they were even taken somewhere else first. And the reasons, you might ask, well, there are some sick individuals out there. Now, as much as some people who are a bit paranoid might want you to believe, it's very unlikely that you would bump into a stranger and they would do this to you. At the very worst, they might rob you, but it's very unlikely that someone would just outright end your life as soon as they've met you. If this is going to happen, it's usually premeditated. It's someone that's been following you or planning this for a while, which makes it tricky, of course, because the girls were interacting with a lot of people, a lot of tourists and locals. Of course, they were scheduled to meet a tour guide the next day. Now, I've seen a lot of people, mostly on Reddit, admittedly, try and pin the blame on this tour guide. Now, I won't share his name, but you can obviously research it. So this tour guide did have a bit of a rough history. I think he'd had some bad reviews where he'd threatened some of the people he was providing a tour to, and I think he had some gang affiliations back in the day. Now, of course, all of that is relatively suspicious, but what you need to know is that in this area, in Panama, most young men, it was quite common to have gang affiliations. So although that is suspicious and raises eyebrows, I don't think we can absolutely say that this individual was involved, especially when there's literally no other evidence other than his past. He, of course, would have known roughly where the girls were. He was supposed to meet them the next day. Maybe he had asked someone to track them or something like that, but in my opinion, there's simply not enough evidence to lean towards that. So alternatively, could this have been someone who was with them on the hike, who had ulterior motives, or maybe decided to do something horrible whilst they were out there? Not likely. As we see, the girls are taking pictures together, they're taking pictures of each other, and it's very unlikely that if there was an individual with them, they wouldn't have been in the pictures or photographs as well. Maybe it's possible that they didn't want to be, but realistically that's very unlikely. And the girls were supposedly, the information is quite choppy, but allegedly the two girls were seen leaving the restaurant on their own to go on this hike. There are countless theories that you could come up with just relating to that. Maybe there was someone with them. Maybe they bumped into someone whilst they were along the trail. Maybe someone did try to rob them and they tried to get away, and that's when this injury occurred. They went into impassable terrain. If you're a small-time criminal and you come across these girls, or you plan to rob these girls, and maybe in the process one of them is really badly injured and it looks like they're not going to make it, you're probably not going to stop to help, and you're also not going to stick around, and you're not going to go to the authorities. So maybe that could have happened somewhere along the way. Maybe it could have even been wildlife. Maybe a predator of some sort had attacked them or even startled them, and that's what caused them to go off trail and get this injury. And there are people that suggest that the photographs taken at night, maybe it was someone else holding the camera. Obviously we have the pictures of the back of Kramer's head. Maybe this was some horrible individual who kidnapped the girls and he was taking pictures of them. But realistically, the pictures are weird, right? It leans more to what I suggested earlier, that she was taking a picture of the girl's head because she was very badly injured. She wanted to see if she had a head injury, anything that needed to be bandaged up, something like that. And then of course you have the photographs, random photographs at night. probably what I suggested, right? To either see the surroundings or flash the light into the night as a signal for any search parties out there. Then of course we have the phone activity. So these girls were basically trying to call the authorities at the same time every morning, almost, to the hour. Very close, almost like a routine. They were trying to call authorities or check their signal every morning. Presumably one of the phone's battery was dying, and eventually it got turned off and they started to sparingly use the other phone. So obviously this doesn't really add up with the foul play theory, unless of course the girls were attacked or kidnapped, whatever it may be, deeper into their disappearance. Or maybe it is the attacker trying to very elaborately cover his tracks by making calls knowing that they're not going to go through, that there's no signal. I think that's very unlikely personally. However, of course, we do have those suspicious attempts to unlock the phone by someone who didn't know the PIN. So the natural inclination is to think that that's someone who's either innocently picked up the phone out of the backpack trying to access the PIN on it. Maybe the phone was dropped on the floor or something like that. Obviously we know that not to be the case because it was found in the backpack. Or maybe it's the person who has committed this foul play, kidnapped them, whatever it may be, is then trying to access the phone. Maybe even, I've seen some people suggest, look for any photographs of them with the girls that they can delete to try and hide any evidence. So that is possible, and it definitely is strange that someone's trying to access it without knowing the PIN, or maybe incorrectly putting the PIN in. But of course, if one of the girls has already passed away or been left behind, the girl that's now got the phone might simply not know the PIN. I think that's honestly more likely. Or she was so delirious that maybe she forgot the PIN, maybe she was very briefly told it by her friend. But of course, when you're starving and thirsty and exhausted, that information can very quickly leave your head. It's not something that you memorize every day. So I think based on that, for me, we can rule out foul play at least to the point where the girls have gone missing and one of them's got injured and one of them's had to go off on their own, basically. I think where it gets suspicious and fishy, if you will, is where the backpack is found. The woman said the backpack wasn't there the day before. Very odd. And of course, everything's neatly laid out in the backpack. Nothing's taken. It's all in good condition. No damage from the surroundings, right? I'm sure it was a good backpack, but if you leave a backpack out in the jungle for a month, presumably it's going to be messed up. It's going to be wrecked. Animals might come and prod and poke at it. And if it was here on the side of a river, it could have very easily become wet or slipped into the river. Anything could have happened. So to me, this maybe implies that someone has found the body with the backpack either on or nearby and has had a rummage inside, maybe taken the backpack home and then thought, this is quite serious, I'm going to go ahead and put this backpack right where I found it. That's what that suggests to me. Or alternatively, as we've found out, the bones were found nearby to the backpack, but not exactly where it was. It took them a duration of time to find the bones after that, so presumably they weren't right there next to it. Maybe this individual found the body close by, somewhere that's not quite as obvious, had a look through the backpack, maybe took the backpack home or kept it on them. Or maybe it was literally in the time frame that this woman was there the previous day and then she went home. Maybe this all happened in that time frame and the person found the body, thought, I don't want anything to do with this, I don't want to get in trouble for this, I'm just going to put this backpack by the river so that someone can find the body, but I'm not going to report it myself because I don't want to get basically thrown in jail for murder. Possibly that's what's happened, because obviously if someone found this body and they were a nasty, horrible person without any morals, they would have just taken the phones and the money. Naturally, that is very loose speculation. Then of course we have another piece of information that is very suspicious, very unusual and doesn't add up. The fact that the bones were analysed and supposedly showed no signs of, not necessarily wear and tear, but no scratches, no scrape marks. If scavengers were feeding on these bones, that would almost definitely show. There's virtually no instance in which that wouldn't happen. Maybe if it's purely insects and detritivores breaking down these bodies over time, I guess that is possible if for whatever reason the local wildlife didn't decide to come and scavenge on the bodies. There's also the injury, the damage to the pelvis. The pelvis was broken, belonging to Kramer, which does add up. Perhaps this was what she had injured. She had some kind of fall and damaged many bones of her body. However, the lack of scratches and scrapes on the bones is suspicious. What that means, however, is largely unknown, right? Maybe the bodies were chopped up in some way, and the areas where it would be obvious that someone's actually used an implement to chop them up were hidden or put somewhere where they wouldn't be found, and only these remains were scattered or put back into nature. But that doesn't add up either. I mean, that's someone really trying to cover their tracks, and it seems unusual. You would assume that you found obvious signs that someone had been hacking at these bodies, had been skinning them, whatever it may be, right? Very unusual. I've seen some people suspicious that the foot was found in the boot. Someone suggested that this was likely caused by a machete or tool, implying that someone's hacked this foot off, and by and large I suppose they would have chopped the body up into small pieces, presumably to hide it or something like that. Seems unlikely to me. Obviously, when bodies decay, they fall apart. That's simply how it is. Sometimes you get perfectly preserved skeletons, but these bodies were out in the jungle, right? They were open to the elements, very likely would have decomposed and just broken apart, especially if the wildlife were getting involved. But weirdly, the evidence suggests that there wasn't much wildlife interaction with these bodies, which is very weird and has led to some more out there theories. I mean, some people have suggested that they were abducted by aliens, things like that. Maybe a little bit more grounded, some people have suggested that they were attacked by primitive people out in the jungle. I don't think there's necessarily that much evidence of primitive people, at least not in large numbers in that area. So I'm not sure why that would have happened. And of course, if they had done anything to the bodies, it would show on the remains, right? On the bones. If they'd, who knows, chopped them up ritualistically or anything like that. So this is one of those situations that's always going to be a mystery. I think I'm leaning heavily towards they went out on the hike alone. They should have had someone with them, really. They went off trail for whatever reason. One of them got injured. She tried to call emergency services at that point, or maybe when they thought they were lost. And then she's tried to maybe carry the injured individual, presumably Kramer, Froon being the more mobile of the two. They've continued on for a while. One of them has either passed away, presumably Kramer once again, or not been able to continue, and Froon has said, I'll get help, or she's sadly gone off on her own to try and get to safety. And then of course she's expired as well, because you can't survive out in the jungle with no resources. It's as simple as that. And then what's happened with the remains is where things get a bit fishy for me. I think someone probably has stumbled across the body. This is a remote area, so it's very likely that didn't happen, but based on what's happened with the backpack, either there's some misinformation from the woman that found it, or someone has found the bodies and, like I said, gotten scared, not reported it to the authorities, and just put the backpack somewhere and left it there. Now, the part that's always going to leave this an open case, if you will, a mystery, even though the case is officially closed, of course, is that forensic analysis of the bones. That's the most unusual element of this, right? Surely, if these two women have been out there deceased in the jungle, something's going to have come and had a nibble at them, for lack of a better word, right? Even if someone had physically harmed them, you would see that on the bones. You can see the blunt force trauma to the pelvis. Presumably that's the injury that was sustained, right? But why are there no markings on the bones? Very strange. It would be interesting to follow up with this Panamanian, that's difficult to say, this Panamanian forensic specialist, right? Because maybe he would just turn around and say, oh, I misspoke, there were markings, I just meant there weren't any signs of human tools used, or something like that. But until then, it's impossible to know, and it makes this a very eerie story. But overall, it really is a tragedy. I'm sure the parents are mortified, or were mortified. This was 10 years ago now. But I'm sure they're still feeling the effects of it today. And yeah, it's just really sad. Whilst researching this, I did a lot of digging. I read some of the diary entries of the two girls leading up to this. Almost, I believe one was right on the day before or the night before they went missing. And it was really quite sad to put myself in their minds. Froon seemed to be quite depressed and not having a good time on the trip. I think a lot of things were getting cancelled and they weren't getting the experience that they'd hoped for. So maybe this hike was them trying to enjoy themselves, enjoy the scenery, despite some of the clashes they were having with the locals and what they'd planned. So it's really sad that things went sour in that way. And they must have been extremely terrified when this was happening. It's hard to even imagine the level of panic. And you can almost see that from the phone activity. They start trying to call authorities, and then there's a period of time where they try very frequently. There's a day where they're trying to call non-stop. And you can really put yourself in their shoes and feel that sense of dread that must have been coming over them. So rest in peace, of course, and condolences, as always, to their family. But let me know what you think in the comments below about the theory. And of course, suggest any other videos that you'd like me to go through. Like the video if you did, share it with a friend, and of course, if you haven't already, subscribe for more creepy content.